Lauren, thanks for joining in this conversation. Basically, I wanted to understand, from a global venture capital perspective, how do you view the evolution of the Japan startup ecosystem? So, if you were to summarize the startup ecosystem, I mean, how would you present it to global investors?
Yeah, so I think this is a very timely moment in the Japanese startup ecosystem. It's gone through several waves already, so maybe this is a third or fourth wave. And with all the latest changes that's been happening, both geopolitically and culturally, I think this is one of the most opportune times for both operators, founders, as well as investors to explore the Japanese market. Obviously, in the first several waves, has had some very strong lessons that it has learned. And with all that's happening in the world right now, there's a number of investors that are trying to figure out what is the Japan play. And it's more than just coming here for LPs, but definitely what are the opportunities to really build and leverage the Japan brand.
Right. So, when you compare Japan with other markets like
Mhm.
US, China, or even Southeast Asia, how do you measure Tokyo's innovation ecosystem when it comes to maturity and opportunity?
Yeah, so it's as I mentioned, I think the US has had many more cycles than Japan. So it's on a different trajectory altogether. So for for Japan itself, I think if one was to view it in the lens of what it does well, which are more infrastructural, more holistically driven, I then one could really truly leverage the strength of the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is this is a very large market for anyone trying to sell their products or services. The last note I read was it's the third or fourth largest enterprise market. Used to be the second, now it's like the fifth, sixth largest GDP globally. So there's a lot of unique dynamics that are still hard to find elsewhere. But at the same time, it's not one where it appreciates hype, it appreciates longevity. And so I think there's a certain, I guess, demeanor, both local investors as well as the local market looks for, because it's not inherently driven by courts or legal rule and more on the relationship, then it has to be built into the DNA of the founder. It has to be built into what you're selling. It cannot be a flash in the pan. Yeah, so with that, I think there's a certain maturity it requires of founders to understand more deeply the customer and how they value these risk and the upside and downside challenges.
You mentioned about relationships. So, is this something which is common across Asia? Because, I mean, culturally, Asians are more relationship driven compared to probably the West. So, is this something that you see common across most Asian countries?
I would say yes, and to a degree that the broad stroke is that in the US, in any, I guess, Commonwealth, UK, Hong Kong type of environments, because there's such a very mature legal infrastructure, the ability to enforce damages and penalties are really clear. But in a environment where it's more trust-based, then you need to demonstrate a lot of this, "We've got your back," in a different way. So, even in, like, Hong Kong and other places, the concept of a warranty and a return is very different than the US, where, it's taken to an extreme, right? And so, that has a very different dynamic in terms of how you go to market, how you price, how you structure your business model.
In terms of, I mean, you mentioned that, this is probably the third or the fourth wave in Japan. So, do you see any structural challenges that still exist within the Japanese startup ecosystem?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of, I think, institutional headwinds. namely around the legal and taxation elements. There was actually a recent event at JETRO, which is a government organization supporting cross-border trade, where a number of investors and founders came to address some of the issues. And so, whether it is around limitations on number of LPs, that's quite unique to Japan relative to like the US, equity crowdfunding, taxation, there's some lag involved, right? Now, there's been new legislative programs that have allowed for angel funding, but it's not necessarily carried on over to later stage investments. And so I think there's been a lot of focus on early stage. The Japanese government in particular has been helpful in terms of helping to support emerging managers, but there needs to be a through line to the exit, right? How do early managers get step ups? How do founders seek growth equity? And that also leads into how does FDI, so whether it's investors from Europe, MENA, or the North American markets, how do they support through their larger check sizes? So there's a lot of just, I would say, infrastructural dynamics that haven't fully been sorted out just yet.
What about the founders and investors themselves? I mean, when it comes to, let's say, the risk appetite in Japan, when you compare it with other global markets, you see any gap in terms of talent, funding stages, or global market access for Japanese startups?
I would say the number one gap is probably due to speed. And some of that is, again, goes back to the legal and what I consider to be an enablement gap. So, as an American, we take for granted all these tools and product services out there, like Carta, Sidecar, anything to help effectively abstract all the overhead in terms of getting business done. So that's one layer. The other is decision making and finding approval. I think the agency element is still a dynamic to be addressed in Japan. At the same time, there's a very earnest desire to really tap into all the IP, to tap into all the work from the R&D and research engineers and universally talents, right? So I think it's just a matter of time before we establish these tools. What has been helpful are the proliferation of events and conferences that I haven't seen, at least personally, in my little small view of Japan. I think that's been really helpful in terms of providing the much needed surface area for exchanges to happen. So we're starting to see beyond just the PEs and hedge funds, other industrial types of investors coming to Japan and getting really excited about what they see here.
How about the Japanese family offices? I mean, are some of these large family offices showing interest in investing into local startups?
So I think it's already there. Family offices by nature are market driven. So Japan is, I would argue, a country of asset managers. And so they'll seek alpha without any bias. And I would argue some of the earliest venture initiatives or venture asset allocators have really been in cross border deployment. So that's not the issue. I think the issue is really how do we bring it back and feed the local ecosystem. So then there is, staying power to grow the home base. And I was talking to another investor this past week about geopolitics and the nature of reshoring. So I think with the drive to really own the supply chain, to really have resiliency, whether you are in North America, you're in Europe, or now in Japan, there's going to be a push to more or less build local. And for me, I think that's exciting because you now have multiple winners as opposed to just a giant monopoly, global monopoly.
You earlier mentioned about seeing more events take place in Japan in this space. So, talking of events, I mean, how do you think platforms like Sushi Tech Tokyo play in connecting Japanese startups? And do you see this as a sign that the Japanese government, and particularly in this case, of course, the Tokyo metropolitan government itself, I mean, stepping up to in terms of helping startups and also bring together investors and the entire ecosystem?
Yeah, I think anytime we have a platform to promote the message, to have a exchange, a dialogue, that's always a an amazing opportunity to not just promote, but also to have a feed to complete the feedback loop, right? So a lot of these events have, I would say, cross-border panelists. I'm running one myself uh, shortly, and to have that dialogue, to have the ability to exchange these views and to explore how do we address these gaps, I think that's a really critical first step in terms of establishing, again, these relationships. And going back to the notion of relationships is that it's not just, I would say, on the capital deployment side, but is also on the investment side. And anytime you're looking to do a raise, is not typically multi-touch. It's a process. So whether you are a fund or a founder, we do need these forums to have familiarity. So we can truly underwrite the character and the overall package.
Which sectors in Japan are currently attracting the most attention? I mean, Japan is often seen as a very strong in deep technology and engineering, and of course now there's been a lot of interest in climate tech, sustainability, and urban resilience technology. So among all these, which are the sectors in Japan that is attracting the most attention from global VCs?
Yeah, so there has been a number of prominent Japanese VCs who have promoted their thesis, and I do agree with some of these, which do includes local plays, so Japan specific. But I think where the most opportune is leaning into Japan's strengths. And I think as Japan has matured as a market, it has really gone sort of downstream into components and infrastructure. So this does play out really nicely into physical AI, or if you want to call it embodied AI, but where the hardware meets the software or software defined X is a huge theme. And the ability for Japan to, I would say, really tap into its SCG goals, which they've been very prominently focused on. I think there's a lot of quiet startups that just haven't necessarily, um, I would say, just done a good job in promoting themselves. So there are a tremendous amount of activity in the energy sector, smart energy or renewables, but that has been historically gate kept through language barriers. And we're starting to see, especially through venues like Sushi Tech, where that is now basically jumping those hurdles. Personally, with the Tokyo AI group that I support, going back to the autonomy of infrastructure theme, there's a number of startups that do work around the space of robotics, materials discovery, and agricultural or agritech. And those are really, really exciting plays because it's not speculative, but they are literally solving our very own needs.
Besides the local Japanese startups, do you see international startups taking interest in entering the Japanese market? And if they do, I mean, is language a big barrier for them?
Sure. So the one particular angle I've seen personally is around deep tech or when they want to scale. So again, Japan is a very lucrative and large enterprise market that is very, very ripe for CX, customer experience enhancements, DX, digital, or AX, AI improvements. And I've been seeing a number of startups coming from the MENA region, some of them are YC included, that once they've established themselves with some proof points and case studies, that they're looking for bigger markets to go into. So from that angle, just a pure GTM, Japan is a very, I would say, much in their backyard. And also on the deep tech side. So if you're doing space tech, manufacturing robotics, especially niche and specialized manufacturing, you're quite limited to China, Korea, and Japan. And Japan, I would say, has a upper hand advantage in terms of a more broader array of industries, where I think historically Korea has been focused around semis and a few other niches. So the language part isn't necessarily a issue. They typically recruit bilinguals to address that sales challenge, or a number of companies typically recruit a country lead, country manager. You do have big name players like Japan Cloud who have been the go-to-market agency on the ground. So I think if you understand the playbook and the plethora of options, it's no longer a hurdle, but because it's enterprise and institutional driven, that requires having your ducks in a row and having your sales enablement playbook built out, right? Because discovery does take a little bit longer, but if you have all those proof points, if you have your battle cards prepared, then you can deploy that Salesforce.
So there are certain stereotypes of the Japanese market, right? I mean, in terms of when it comes to diversity and particularly even including gender diversity. So how, as the whole startups ecosystem evolves, how do you see this from the investment ecosystem, and do you believe that more inclusive ecosystems are required in play for more stronger innovation outcomes?
Yeah, so there's been a number of initiatives to equalize and to leverage the unique aspects of diversity, including whether it's gender, racial, or otherwise. And I think beyond the some of the mandates from board seats or director representation, the culture has shifted post COVID in terms of who's at the table. That said, obviously a lot more can be done, but at the end of the day, it's just about who's hungriest and who can perhaps grow the fastest. So I haven't necessarily seen limitations. If anything, especially with the Gen Z generation, especially through the undergrad students I've worked with, it's been a pretty hungry next generation.
So as we get ready for Sushi Tech, and as you're going to be moderating a panel there, and obviously you're going to be around. So what are the top three things that you're going to look forward to at Sushi Tech? I mean, what are you going to be looking for?
Yeah, so I think one particular area is connecting with other early stage investors to support our Tokyo AI community. They're always looking for funding, looking for new partners to explore POCs and pilots. I'm personally always looking to expand upon my own investment or thesis around why Japan and what's next. And three, just looking for amazing folks to collaborate with. And this has now been my fourth year here, and every week now I'm been fortunate to make new friends and potential business partners.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren, for this conversation. And I hope to see you in Tokyo at the Sushi Tech Tokyo later this month.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.